Blood Money, episode 85, Taking Action with the COVID Tyranny Task Force. This series shows us what happens when regular people get together and take action against a tyranny. All right, we're on the latest episode of Blood Money here. Today I have some very special guests from the COVID Tyranny Task Force. Do you mind if I just have all you gentlemen, this is the most guests we've had actually, for a recent episode. Could you do a quick little introduction on yourselves, your background, and in what capacity you work with the COVID Tyranny Task Force?
Excellent. Okay,
Sure.
I'll go first.
Sure, yeah.
So my name is Scott Kiley. I'm a resident here in Collier County. And I met Richard back, probably in 2021. We were actually interviewing candidates for new school board positions that were coming up. Mm-hmm. And in that, I learned Richard had founded the COVID Tyranny Task Force. And my wife and I were very interested in health freedom issues as the tyranny was unfolding. And so I immediately joined that task force. And here we are today fighting the good fight.
Awesome. Dr. George.
Yeah, I'm a cardiologist. I'm board certified in non-invasive cardiology and in nuclear cardiology. I've been a physician for 30 years. I was working in the front lines in New York. And then after pretty much taking care of people in the hospital for over a year and a half, approximately 6 months later, the hospital that I was working with, which I was affiliated for a long period of time, decided to place a mandate on me to get the COVID vaccine. And I told them that I would not get it. They decided to cancel my previously approved religious exemption, and I decided to leave. So that's what made me come down to Florida. And that's what made me promise to myself that I would do whatever I could politically to not allow this kind of nonsense to happen again. And the COVID Tyranny Task Force was appropriately named for me. I figured that was the group for me.
Nice. Dr. Schroeder.
Yeah, yes, and I want to say we're so glad to have Scott and George in the COVID Tyranny Task Force. George is actually still a real, very actively practicing doctor. I'm a retired obstetrician gynecologist. I trained at Baylor in Houston and then moved on to the service and then practiced for 20 years in a growing multi-specialty group in the Midwest, and then moved out to the Puget Sound area near Seattle, where I was had got to observe a very large hospital system close hand by all the things I did there. So that was my background, and that's when I began to become concerned about all that was going on in the House of Medicine. And then after I had finally just retired and thought I was going to actually retire, the planned COVID pandemic hit. And as George and Scott mentioned, we kind of all got together spontaneously, if you will. We were originally part of a larger group that was concerned with all types of tyranny and removal of our personal freedoms. But the COVID Tyranny Task Force developed as a subgroup of that to address specifically the medical tyrannies. And as a part of that, it's grown exponentially since that time.
Before we get into the exact work that the COVID Tyranny Task Force does, I mean, one of the things that's really curious to us is because we interview a lot of frontline doctors, and it seems as though out of 1 million doctors, you had maybe a few hundred that stood up, that did their own research. In fact, the words that have come out of the gentleman's mouth here, I mean, in the last 3 minutes, we've heard more truth than you hear in the mainstream media if you listen to it for like a year. Why is it that so many doctors embrace fiction as opposed to standing up to this tyranny and the obvious fact that these jabs are not good for you?
Well, I could take that one if you want. I'll tell you, there's a lot of people in, I was part of a very large group, and fear drove a lot of their decision making, just like it drove the decision making for the public. And so fear of losing a job, fear of not being able to provide for your family. And some people were aware that something was wrong And I think the biggest time people started questioning in the physicians' world was when they were trying to get ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine for themselves, and they were being blocked by corporate pharmacies from access to medications that were just repurposed medications. And that's when a lot of people started to get suspicious, but only some took it further instead of just washing it aside and saying, listen, I just got to do my job. I got to provide for my family. So fear is the biggest problem why people are not fully awakening. And I think that's changing as time goes on. More patients who have even gotten the vaccine and regret it, and even physicians who have gotten the vaccine and regret it because they've developed health problems and injuries are starting to wake up. But hopefully it's not too late for that population. And I for one, work to try to heal people from the injuries that I've been seeing from the COVID vaccine.
You know, one of the other things that occurred to us as we're interviewing, because we interview a lot of people that have been affected badly by the vaccines, a lot of doctors we've interviewed that have been destitute, you know, because they fought the system, they've been fighting the system, lost their jobs, you know, a lot of hardships. Now, the stories that we keep hearing are people that are affected, have some kind of trauma in their lives due to tyranny. You know, one doctor was telling me about just a generation ago how her family escaped Cuba. Another one was talking about how her family escaped the USSR. Another one was talking about genocides in their history. And these have been motivating factors for people to stand up. I don't want to get too personal, but I have to ask, is there a personal reason for each one of you that you recognize that there's something really wrong here, something in your past, something that you are aware of that became a motivating factor to stand up?
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, for me personally, I'm 59 years old. I have 3 children and I have 3 grandchildren. My wife and I, our eldest daughter started to have children. We're blessed to have 3 grandchildren. She's not vaccinated her children. And one of the things that we did is we started around 2019 when we moved to Florida. We started on a health kick because we learned and we discovered all the toxins in our food and how important it was to eat clean and to deal with water and make sure your water is purified. And so we became very conscientious to just all the different ways it seems like they're trying to poison the population with toxins in food. We also became very much aware of Paul Thomas, Dr. Paul Thomas, and his family-friendly vaccine program. And if you know Paul Thomas, I believe it's 10,000 patients. He's seen patients from birth all the way till their 18th birthday, and he's got a good mix of fully vaccinated, completely unvaccinated, or partially vaccinated. And he used that to put together his book, his tell-all on what to do. And he's got great data on autism, for example. And so we provided that to our daughter. And so, you know, for us, that was really a motivating factor for us to get involved. You know, we also see the tyranny that's been unfolding and the trampling on our constitutional rights, and really the fact that, you know, very little has been done, even in the great state of Florida, very little has been done to address it. And I'm getting ahead a little bit, but that's certainly what has led us to the action that we've taken with the COVID Tyranny Task Force, with the resolution, with the ordinance, with sending back CDC money. And it's empowering. And then we need to get citizens across the state in every single county to rise up. That's what we're looking to do.
Awesome. Yeah, I mean, just quick note on the food and water there. It's funny because just interviewing these doctors, we started really purifying our water. And that alone makes such a significant difference. You don't realize how badly you're being poisoned until, you know, you go the other way. And I could see how that was pretty eye-opening, that the message coming down from above is usually something that's not good for you, something that, you know, drink that water, eat that food, and ultimately that causes destruction in your health. Do any of the other gentlemen have background stories as to what was their motivating factor?
I mean, I do. I'm of a Greek heritage, and there is definitely an indoctrination as I was growing up about our history. You know, we were enslaved for 400 years by the Ottoman Empire, and the religious persecution that occurred to try to pretty much genocidally transfer everybody from their Greek heritage to an Ottoman heritage was was amazing. And hearing how people would sit there and train their children in the middle of the night in caves for fear that they would get killed, just so that they can learn how to read or learn something about their religion. And so that's always been in my background. And then as time went on, I'm a very proud American. I was born in the 60s, raised in the 70s, and you don't get more American than I do, despite that Greek heritage. And to see some of the things that happened that were signs of corruption at the government level when it came to health, from something as simple as the food pyramid to a lot of the corruption that was seen during the AIDS epidemic, to some things that admittedly happened during previous vaccine campaigns that were purposely done and caused a lot of injury to people. These stories, as they keep cropping up, lets you know that people at the top don't always have your best interests at heart. And it's reinforced for me how important it is for us to be politically active locally. And if everybody could do that and we could sort of coalesce that energy, it's going to translate to a national debate and a national fervor for liberty. And that's what we're really trying to do here.
Wow. Amazing. Yeah. Dr. Schroeder.
Yeah. Well, I have some motivating factors, and then I had the final blow. Okay. I mentioned that I spent the last 20 years of my working career in corporate medicine, so to speak, in a very large hospital-based organization. And as time went on, I kind of grew to become uncomfortable with a whole number of things that I saw going on sort of in the house of medicine. And it was a whole panoply of stuff. It was the annual flu shots, which I tried to avoid like the plague, and often got jabbed in the rear by a surreptitious nurse or something. I mean, it was strange. And then of course the Gardasil vaccines with their known hazards to women, and the absolutely ridiculous assertions in the way that product was developed and sold to physicians. And I also observed the same kind of push from big tech and big pharma, where any kind of major technology was being brought out. Like in my field, it was robotic surgery, and I could see the subtle push to bend the indications for doing the surgery to get more experience or to get more revenue for the hospital, though it was very subtle and uncomfortable situations that were just became unbearable. And then I saw the electronic medical record being rolled out. I think our organization was one of the first, if not the first, to implement Epic medical record. And then, of course, I got to witness all the younger physicians just glued to their computer instead of to the patients, and just simply following the protocols that were in the electronic medical record. So all of those things. And then I got to be medical director of women's care, and found that I was being subtly asked to include vaccinations as part of the reward program for compensation for physicians. And all of that was just sort of a preamble. And after I retired and I had become awakened to what was kind of going on generally in the world, the crowning blow was when, after all of the beseeching and education and anything I could do, all of my own grown children, who happened to live in 2 blue states, just went entirely woke.
Wow.
And all received the vaccine, and I just became somewhat enraged and stayed with it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just going to go through the statements each one of you made. I mean, Scott, we obviously talked about how in our offices we experienced a very simple thing like purifying our water, and what a dramatic difference that made in our health. Now, Dr. Schroeder, what's interesting is that as we were researching about the COVID vaccine, I mean, we discovered thalidomide and what that did in the 60s to children. And then there was the overprescribing of opiates that until today kills up to 100,000 people and ravages towns. And this seemed to have been okay. Dr. George, one of the things I didn't reveal, I'm actually Armenian and Greek. Mm-hmm. And the reasons you stated, I didn't want to break the flow, but your reasons for doing this are literally my reasons for doing it, because my ancestors on both sides came from the Ottoman Empire, and I actually traveled to Turkey incognito. There's going to be a special episode about that in the future, where I went there under a different name, traveled from Istanbul all the way to the border of Armenia on the east, and really what I discovered was that when they committed the genocide against the Greeks and the Armenians, there was literally a list of 10 things that they did, right? Dehumanizing the population, removing the men, and other elements, like you can't harbor Armenians or Greeks, and that's punishable by death. And these were 2/3 citizens. For people that don't know, 2/3 human citizens. For people that don't know the history, if you're a Christian minority in the Ottoman Empire, you essentially had no rights in court. You were basically 2/3 human, and they could do with you whatever they want to do. That's why some of the stories that Dr. George was talking about, the beautiful women tried to unbeautify themselves so they wouldn't get kidnapped and taken to harem. So it was a really dark history. And then that ultimately really came to a point where they said, hey, we're going to have this liberal government. All the minorities voted for the liberal government. And then 3-4 years later, a genocide started. And when I see those same steps out of literally a list of 10 steps, and we're already at number 6, saying that men are toxic, dehumanizing the men, trying to, really pollute society with propaganda, that really scares the hell out of me. And that's really the reason why we do this series and why we speak to individuals like yourself, because the mainstream media is not doing it. So apologies for the rant there, but I just wanted to connect all this together. Tell me about the COVID Tyranny Task Force, of how it all came together, and what was the first steps that you took as a group, and where that's led you till today.
Yeah, I can take you down through the COVID Tyranny Task Force and kind of get us pointed to where we are today and what our main area of action is right now. The first of them I wanted to say, you mentioned the thalidomide situation back in the I believe it was the late 50s or early 60s. Mm-hmm. I had kind of a sort of a personal brush with that, in the sense that my father was an education professor in the university where Dr. Kessley was doing her work, and became familiar and publicized the risks of thalidomide right there at the University of South Dakota. So I got to hear about that firsthand. I was just a kid. I didn't really understand it completely, but it kind of sensitized me to that sort of thing as I was subject to these pictures of the babies without limbs and so forth. So I had that way in the background. That's just a way back sidelight, but it was interesting.
Yeah, I mean, when you see that, sorry to interrupt you, when you see that sort of thing of what they're willing to do and cover up, and I mean, the lawsuits were those weren't big lawsuits in terms of what was paid out. It really does tell you that, this is a dangerous industry. It's a dangerous.
Right, prime and any. This was a German manufactured sleeping pill. It was all it was, and look at the damage that it did. Mm-hmm. And there are other drugs that have done similar things. They've slipped in, like diethylstilbestrol, and there's just a host of others that
many more since that time, right, Richard? I mean, the list is tremendous, and they're not just in the OBGYN realm, but it just goes to show you there's a pattern behind that pharma industry that can be very dangerous, because there's a lot of money to be made. So.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, and the money drives it. And of course, we all know, as I'm sure other guests have spoken about on your program many times, about the big pharma influence on medical education, and the fact that we're basically a captured industry and propagandized from the get-go the minute we enter medical school, in good faith, in my opinion. So anyway. The COVID Tyranny Task Force and where we get today. At first, because at first we mostly stood up at county commissioners meeting and protested masking, protested lockdowns. There were protests against masks at grocery stores, where I recall a group of 50 of us gained our way quite unceremoniously into Trader Joe's until they relented, and all sorts of things. There was a gentleman in our group who came to be the leader of the protest movement. He was a guy who could stand on a street corner with a bullhorn and just give you nonstop monologue and harassed all of the poor people wearing masks in their cars and anything you can imagine. So he would organize the rallies. We'd rally and protest. We'd rally in front of hospitals that were demanding their employees be jabbed. We'd rally. We'd rally at fairs. We'd rally against businesses that were requiring vaccine passports, and in that we actually corroborated with a local Christian group that really helped us out, and we had a lot of fun with that. We also had people that stepped up to do things like one person led the charge to get us a donated truck where we put a big moving billboard where we were railing against jabbing of children, and that went all sorts of places,
Nice.
including the Crimes Against Humanity conference in Fort Myers. And every place we took it, of course, it sat and gave the message. And even after it had seen better days and the radiator started to fall out and it was no longer drivable, it remained parked for the longest time along a major thoroughfare as a standing billboard. So that happened. And then there was another extremely talented person in our group who had actually worked and was familiar with Dr. Fauci, who organized a great national conference that we had last April called COVID Unraveled. And actually George was one of the highlight speakers at that meeting. And so we do that sort of thing. And Scott had mentioned one of the most recent things we did is we found that the CDC or that the county had accepted CDC money as part of a farm workers grant program. And we successfully, many groups of us, including the County Republican Party, helped to get that turned around at the county commissioners level. And now we've just had a very successful movement that's been led by the relentless Scott Kiley to have our county commissioners on board with us in passing the Healthcare Freedom Ordinance and Resolution.
And a big piece of that, by the way, was that when these commissioners and when people were running for office, we were the ones posing the health questions, trying to find out where they stood about health and liberty. Wow. And that's what really helped to sort of move things in the right direction. So you need to be activated way before you're trying to pass an ordinance. You need to be there all the time, bringing up these concerns. So.
Yeah, George is absolutely right about that. It was actually necessary to elect 2 new people to the Board of Commissioners, and our group, along with the Part-Time Patriot Group and many others in town, we're leading the charge and making sure that the candidates were vetted and elected. So
that's all. So Scott, how are you getting through to some of these commissioners are you just like cold calling them? Are you showing up at their door? I mean, what's the process that you go through just to get their attention,
Mm-hmm. Good question, Ben. Well, listen, I'm a business owner. I've started 4 companies in my time. I've sold 3 of those companies. So I do know how to sell. I do know how to project manage, and I've been working with hundreds of people, hundreds of employees for, 30 years. So it's pretty good at that. With our county commissioners, it has been a process that has been showing them respect. Okay, they're citizens just like we are. If you set them back on their heels and put them in a defensive posture, that's not going to work. Continual education, bringing them information. Really, I would bring them information. George, Richard, different people from our COVID Tyranny Task Force would bring them information. My wife, who's very active with me, would bring them information. For example, we bought them the Edward Dowd Cause Unknown book. My wife put a personal note in there and a bow on each book and dropped it off to each commissioner. It was put on their desk. Okay, wow. So that's a fantastic book in which to educate them. We got them the Naomi Wolf ebook that highlights all the Pfizer data that her 3,500 analysts have dissected all of that, the Pfizer documents that were said to be concealed. They were asked to be concealed for 75 years. About those documents. Yep. So we educated our commissioners. We met with them one-on-one, lots of phone calls. We worked with them over time. And then ultimately, when we brought forward the resolution in the ordinance, the first commissioner meeting was on March 28th. The second commissioner meeting was on April 11th, where those two pieces got voted in.
Wow.
The March 28th meeting, what I did is I organized really prominent speakers. So we had just quality speakers. We had, I opened, we had George Yakos. We had a local internist named Anthony D'Agostino, who was an early treatment guy in Naples, Collier County from the get-go. We had Karen Kingston, and biomed analyst, come and present just incredible, devastating evidence with regard to the Department of Defense contract with Pfizer, and just the all the known just horrific evidence prior to the rollout. We had another guest that we had in, an incredible speaker. We had in Dr. Pete Chambers. Are you familiar with Dr. Pete Chambers?
No, not Dr. Pete Chambers, no.
He is a 39-year Army veteran, Green Beret doctor, Purple Heart recipient. And so he's been in multiple combat duties. When the Green Berets go out, Dr. Pete Chambers goes with them. When